The Drothak High Council's chamber was an unholy blend of grandeur and menace. Spires of translucent crystal jutted from the floor like frozen lightning bolts, their edges refracting the eerie green glow that filled the vast hall. The air was thick, not just with the faint metallic tang of ionized energy, but with an almost suffocating arrogance. This was where empires plotted conquest, and today Earth was their target. General Drothak stood at the center of the chamber, his imposing frame cast in the alien glow. His armor, an intricate weave of obsidian plating and pulsing bioluminescent veins, hummed faintly with power. His 6 yellow eyes scanned the council members seated in their high-backed thrones, gauging their reactions. They wore expressions of cold detachment, their elongated faces betraying neither approval nor dissent, as Drothak's deep, guttural voice filled the chamber. "Esteemed counselors," Drothak began, spreading his spindly arms wide as if to embrace the universe itself. "The humans are but gnats in the grand tapestry of our dominion. Their technology is crude, their understanding of the cosmos laughable. Yet, they are bold enough to defy us." He gestured toward a holographic display that flickered to life beside him, projecting an image of Earth. The swirling blues and greens of the planet seemed almost mocking, as if daring them to take their best shot. "We have analyzed their weaknesses," Drothak continued, his voice carrying the weight of certainty. "They are fiercely protective of their offspring. Their young, as vulnerable as larvae, are left in poorly defended facilities, often clustered together in densely populated zones. By seizing their children, we strike at the very heart of their primitive society." The counselors murmured among themselves, their whispers like the rustling of dry leaves. Drothak allowed himself a small, smug smile. They would approve his plan. How could they not? It was elegant, decisive, and ruthlessly efficient. Counselor Zhaev, her thin lips curling in a semblance of a smile, leaned forward. Her voice was soft, almost serpentine. "And you are certain, General, that this will achieve compliance?" Drothak's chest swelled. "Certain, Counselor. Humanity's emotional fragility will be their undoing. With their young in our grasp, they will grovel before us." The holographic display shifted, zooming in on 5 key locations on Earth. Each was marked with crimson glyphs, schools, innocuous-looking buildings that teemed with the next generation of humanity. Drothak pointed a clawed finger at the projections, his voice rising with theatrical intensity. "We will strike simultaneously at these 5 locations, capturing their young with precision and efficiency. Within hours, Earth will kneel before the might of the Drothak." The counselors nodded in unison, a gesture that sent a ripple of approval through the chamber. Drothak bowed deeply, his grin predatory. He had no doubt that his plan would cement his place in Drothak history as the general who brought humanity to its knees. But arrogance is a blindfold, and Drothak wore his with pride. Thousands of miles away, on a crisp autumn morning in New Mexico, the hum of schoolyard laughter filled the air. Canyon Ridge Elementary stood against a backdrop of red sandstone cliffs, its low-slung buildings bathed in the golden light of dawn. The smell of freshly cut grass mingled with the faint, comforting aroma of chalk dust and cafeteria coffee. Commander James Falk, now Mr. Falk to his students, stood at the edge of the playground, his sharp eyes scanning the horizon. Years of military training had left their mark on him. His posture was impossibly straight, his gaze always vigilant. Yet here, surrounded by the chatter of children and the rhythmic creak of swings, he had found a semblance of peace. "Mr. Falk!" A chorus of voices pulled him from his thoughts. A group of third-graders sprinted toward him, their faces alight with excitement. Among them was Alex, a wiry boy with a mop of unruly brown hair and an insatiable curiosity that reminded Falk of himself at that age. "Watch this!" Alex shouted, launching himself off a swing with a whoop. He landed with a graceless thud but sprang to his feet, grinning triumphantly. "Impressive," Falk said with a nod, a rare smile ghosting across his face. "But maybe stick the landing next time." The boy laughed, undeterred, and ran back to his friends. Falk watched them for a moment longer, a strange pang tugging at his chest. It was the same feeling he always got when he thought of his own daughter, gone now for 3 long years. He shoved the thought away and turned his attention back to the schoolyard. The air shifted. It was subtle at first, a faint hum that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. Faulk's instincts prickled, the hairs on the back of his neck standing on end. The sunlight dimmed, a shadow stretching across the playground like the hand of some great unseen predator. Above, the sky seemed to ripple. Clouds scattered as something massive and unseen disrupted the atmosphere. Faulk's heart thundered in his chest as he scanned the heavens. Then, with a low, resonant hum, the Drothak ship decloaked. It was a leviathan, a monstrosity of jagged black metal that blotted out the sun. Its surface pulsed with veins of glowing green light, and the very air seemed to shudder in its presence. A collective gasp rose from the children and teachers below, the playground falling eerily silent. "Inside! Now!" Faulk's voice cut through the stillness like a whip, and the children obeyed without question, their laughter replaced by frightened murmurs. Faulk herded them toward the school's main building, his mind racing. He didn't know who these invaders were, but he knew an attack when he saw one. The ship emitted a low, resonating hum, and a beam of light shot down, enveloping the playground in an otherworldly glow. Faulk turned just in time to see the first child lifted off the ground, their screams piercing the air. "No!" Faulk bellowed, sprinting toward the beam. He grabbed Alex's wrist as the boy was pulled upward, his feet leaving the ground. Faulk's muscles strained, his boots digging into the dirt, but the beam's pull was too strong. It wrenched Alex from his grasp, and Faulk fell to his knees, helpless. Around him more children were taken, their small forms silhouetted against the blinding light. Faulk's heart twisted as their screams faded, swallowed by the Drothak ship. The beam disappeared as abruptly as it had appeared, leaving the playground empty and eerily still. Faulk pushed himself to his feet, his jaw clenched, his fists trembling with rage. His students, his responsibility, were gone, and whoever had taken them had made a grave mistake. Above, the Drothak ship hovered, its shadow casting the playground in darkness. Faulk's eyes narrowed, his mind already shifting into the cold, calculated focus of a soldier. "You have no idea what you've just started," he muttered. Somewhere deep in the Drothak ship, as children huddled in fear, and alien captors congratulated themselves on their flawless plan, they could not have known they'd just provoked the one species that never stopped fighting for its own. The sterile chill of the Drothak warship pressed against James Falk's skin like an unwelcome embrace. The air tasted of metallic tang and something acrid, as though the ship exhaled its disdain for its uninvited passengers. Dim green lights pulsated rhythmically along the seamless walls, casting long, eerie shadows that seemed to writhe with malevolence. Faulk crouched low in the corner of the containment chamber, his mind racing even as his heart ached with guilt and fury. The chamber itself was a hollow parody of comfort, a wide, cylindrical room with translucent panels along its curved walls, holding dozens of children in faintly glowing cells. Their small faces, pale with fear, pressed against the panels as they peered out at Faulk with desperate, silent questions. He forced himself to meet their gazes, steadying his breath, grounding himself in their need for reassurance. Alex was among them, his fists pounding weakly against the barrier that held him. His face was streaked with tears, but his eyes burned with a defiant gleam. Faulk's stomach twisted. This wasn't a classroom anymore. It was a battlefield, and Faulk had no intention of letting these children become casualties. He swept his gaze over the chamber, cataloging every detail. The faint hum of energy barriers vibrated through the floor beneath him. The scent of overheated circuits hung thick in the air, mingling with the quiet sobs of the younger children. The Drothak guards stationed at the chamber's exit were motionless but not inattentive, their tall, insectoid forms outlined by the pulsating green lights. Their chitinous exoskeletons glinted like polished stone, their multifaceted eyes scanning the room with cold precision. Faulk pressed a hand against the wall, feeling its faint warmth beneath his fingers. The ship was alive in its own way, a beast made of metal and arrogance. He closed his eyes, focusing on the steady rhythm of its vibrations. Somewhere in this hulking monstrosity was a weakness, a thread he could pull to unravel its control. "Mr. Falk," a small voice whispered. He turned to see Alex crouched against the barrier of his cell, his eyes wide but steady. "What do we do?" Falk's jaw tightened. Alex was watching him with the unshakable faith of a child who believed in heroes. And that, Falk realized, was what he had to be. Not for himself, but for every small, frightened face staring out from those cells. "We fight," Falk murmured, his voice low but firm, quietly, carefully, "but we fight." He scanned the chamber again, this time looking for tools, opportunities. His military training came back to him in sharp, vivid fragments: how to assess terrain, identify vulnerabilities, exploit the arrogance of the enemy. The Drothak guards were a good starting point. They stood like statues, their elongated limbs twitching faintly with each pulse of the ship's lights. Overconfident, dismissive, perfect. Falk pressed his palm to the ground, his fingers trailing along the faint seam of a maintenance hatch. The Drothak, for all their advanced technology, had the same fatal flaw as every conquering empire. They underestimated what they didn't understand. And right now, they didn't understand him. A low hiss broke the tense quiet, the sound of the chamber door sliding open. The two guards snapped to attention, their insectoid heads swiveling toward the newcomers. Falk pressed himself into the shadows, his body taut as a drawn bowstring. Two Drothak officers entered, their sleek armor a darker, richer hue than the guards. One of them, a towering figure with a crest of bioluminescent spikes along its skull, clicked its mandibles as it addressed the children. "Silence," the officer commanded in a voice like grinding stone. "You are cargo, nothing more. You will remain here until we determine your value." The children shrank back, their small forms trembling. Falk's hands clenched into fists, his nails biting into his palms. He forced himself to stay still, to wait. Patience was a weapon, as sharp and deadly as any blade. The second officer approached the nearest cell, peering down at a small girl who clutched a stuffed animal to her chest. It tilted its head, its mandibles clicking thoughtfully. "Fragile creatures," it said, almost as though marveling at the frailty before it. How easily they would break. Falk's blood burned, his muscles coiling with barely restrained rage. He measured his breaths, his mind calculating the steps ahead. He would need a distraction, something to draw the guards and officers away. But he couldn't risk the children, not yet. Then he noticed Alex. The boy's hands were moving, quick and nimble, as he worked at the seams of his cell's control panel. Falk's chest swelled with pride and apprehension. The kid was smart, too smart for his own good. Falk caught his gaze, shaking his head slightly, but Alex gave him a faint, defiant smirk. The same smirk Falk had seen earlier on the playground, just before Alex launched himself off the swing. The panel sparked. The hum of Alex's barrier stuttered, flickered. The officers snapped their heads toward the sound, their mandibles flaring as they barked commands to the guards. Falk used the distraction, slipping across the chamber with silent precision. He reached Alex's cell just as the barrier flickered again, and he pressed a hand to the boy's shoulder. "Not bad," Falk whispered. "But next time, wait for the signal." Alex grinned, his fear momentarily forgotten. "What's the signal?" "This." Falk grabbed a small, jagged shard of metal from the floor, a loose piece from the cell's base, and hurled it toward the far wall. It struck with a resounding clang, echoing through the chamber like a gunshot. The guards and officers whipped around, their weapons drawn, as Falk pulled Alex through the now deactivated barrier. "Stay low," Falk hissed, dragging Alex toward the maintenance hatch he'd identified earlier. "And stay quiet." The other children watched, their eyes wide with hope and terror. Falk glanced at them, his mind racing. He couldn't free them all, not yet, but he could lay the groundwork, plant the seeds of their escape. He crouched by the hatch, prying it open with the jagged shard. Alex slipped inside, his small frame disappearing into the narrow tunnel. Falk followed, pausing only to glance back at the children still trapped in their cells. "Stay strong," he whispered, his voice carrying across the chamber. "We'll come back for you. I promise." Then he disappeared into the shadows, the hatch sliding shut behind him. The tunnel was cramped, the air stifling, but Faulk welcomed the darkness. It was a cloak, a shield. Here the Drothak's arrogance could not reach him. Alex's voice came from ahead, a faint, quavering whisper. "What now?" Faulk's lips pressed into a thin line. "Now, we find their weakness." And somewhere in the cold, unyielding heart of the Drothak ship, the seeds of defiance began to grow. The maintenance tunnels were a labyrinth of angular shadows and whispering echoes. Green, bioluminescent veins ran along the walls, pulsing faintly like the ship's distant heartbeat. James Falk crawled through the narrow space with Alex close behind him, their movements deliberate and silent. The cold metal pressed against their palms, radiating a faint vibration that told Falk the ship was alive in its own unsettling way. The air was thick with the sterile tang of lubricants and the faint ozone scent of overworked circuits. Every sound, the creak of their movement, the faint scuttling of maintenance drones in unseen crevices, seemed amplified, magnified by the oppressive silence of the Drothak warship. "Where are we going?" Alex whispered, his voice barely audible. "Up," Falk replied, his tone clipped. "To their control systems. We need to know how this thing works." Alex hesitated, then nodded. The boy's bravery was remarkable, but Falk could see the tension in his movements, the tremor in his hands. He couldn't let Alex see his own uncertainty, couldn't let the boy know that his plan was still taking shape, the pieces only now falling into place. The tunnel narrowed further, forcing them to slide on their stomachs. Falk's muscles burned with the effort, the faint taste of copper rising in his throat as he bit back a grunt. The ship's vibrations grew stronger here, a rhythmic pulse that seemed to sync with his own rapid heartbeat. Ahead, a faint glow illuminated the end of the tunnel. Falk paused, holding up a hand to stop Alex. He craned his neck, peering through the narrow slit where the tunnel opened into a larger chamber. The room below was vast, a cathedral of alien technology. Towering pylons pulsed with green energy, their surfaces alive with shifting glyphs that Faulk couldn't decipher. Thin conduits snaked across the floor like veins, feeding power to the central node, a massive, orb-like structure suspended in the air by 3 curved arms of jagged metal. Drothak technicians moved with deliberate precision, their insectoid forms reflected in the polished surfaces of their equipment. The air was alive with the hum of energy and the occasional sharp hiss of steam escaping from overworked vents. "This is it," Falk murmured. "The ship's power core." Alex pressed himself closer, his wide eyes taking in the alien machinery. "What do we do?" Falk's mind worked quickly, his training kicking in. "We sabotage it. Not enough to destroy the ship, yet. Just enough to cause chaos, give the others a chance to fight back." He glanced at Alex, noting the boy's trembling fingers. "But we need to stay quiet, stay hidden. One wrong move, and they'll be on us before we can blink." Alex swallowed hard but nodded. "I'll be quiet." "Good." Falk gave him a brief, reassuring smile, then motioned for him to stay put. "Wait here, I'll go first." He slid out of the tunnel with practiced ease, landing soundlessly on the grated floor below. The air was warmer here, thick with the heat radiating from the power core. He moved quickly, his boots barely making a sound as he wove between the towering pylons, keeping to the shadows. His eyes darted across the room, cataloging details. The technicians were engrossed in their work, their backs turned to him. The conduits feeding the power core were exposed, their surfaces humming faintly. Falk reached into his pocket, pulling out the makeshift tool he'd fashioned from the shard of metal and a few scavenged wires. The tool wasn't much, just a crude short-circuit device, but it would be enough. He crouched beside the nearest conduit, his fingers working quickly to attach the device. The metal was warm to the touch, almost alive, as though it resented his interference. A faint hiss escaped the device as it latched onto the conduit. The green glow flickered and a low, ominous hum filled the room. Falk slipped back into the shadows, his pulse racing. He moved to the next conduit, repeating the process, his movements fluid and precise. As he worked, his thoughts drifted to the children in the containment chamber. He could still see their terrified faces, hear their muffled cries. He couldn't let them down. Not now. Not ever. A sudden clatter jolted him from his thoughts. He froze, his heart hammering in his chest. Across the room, a technician had dropped a tool, the sharp metallic clang echoing through the chamber. The other Drothak turned, their multifaceted eyes scanning the room. Faulk pressed himself against the base of a pylon, his breath shallow. The hum of the power core seemed deafening now, a taunting reminder of the danger surrounding him. He could feel the vibrations through the floor, the ship's lifeblood pulsing beneath his feet. One of the Drothak technicians approached the conduit he'd sabotaged, its antennae twitching. It examined the device, clicking its mandibles in agitation. Faulk's fingers tightened around the shard of metal in his hand, his muscles coiling like a spring. But before the technician could raise the alarm, another hum filled the room, a higher-pitched, erratic sound that set Faulk's teeth on edge. He turned his head just in time to see Alex, halfway out of the tunnel, frantically pressing buttons on a small control panel. The boy's tampering sent a cascade of lights flickering across the pylons. The technicians hissed in confusion, their attention diverted as they scrambled to stabilize the system. Faulk took the opportunity to slip back into the shadows, his mind racing. "Alex!" he hissed as he reached the tunnel's opening. "What are you doing?" "Helping," Alex whispered back, his voice shaking. "I figured out how to overload their system. Just a little." Faulk's frustration was tempered by admiration. The kid was resourceful, no doubt about it. But they couldn't afford mistakes. "Stay put," Faulk said firmly, pulling himself back into the tunnel. "We've done enough here. Time to move." They retreated into the darkness, the hum of the power core fading behind them. Faulk's mind churned with the implications of their sabotage. They'd planted the seeds of chaos, but it was only a matter of time before the Drothak traced it back to them. As they crawled deeper into the ship, the air grew colder, the shadows darker. Faulk could feel the weight of the ship pressing down on him, a constant reminder of the danger they faced. But he also felt something else, a spark of hope. They were fighting back, piece by piece, step by step. Ahead, the tunnel opened into another chamber, this one smaller and dimly lit. Faulk motioned for Alex to stay close as they stepped into the room. It was filled with consoles, their surfaces alive with alien glyphs. A faint hum emanated from the machinery, the sound low and steady. Faulk approached one of the consoles, his fingers hovering over the glowing symbols. He didn't understand the language, but he recognized the patterns. Navigation systems. He could use this. If he could disable the ship's ability to move, it would buy Earth precious time. "Alex," he said, his voice low, "keep watch." The boy nodded, his small frame tense as he stood by the doorway. Faulk's fingers moved across the console, his military instincts guiding him. The screen flickered, the glyphs shifting as he accessed the ship's systems. Outside the chamber, faint voices echoed through the halls. The Drothak were searching for them. Faulk's hands worked faster, his pulse quickening. They were running out of time, but he refused to stop. This was their fight, their moment to turn the tide. The screen blinked, the glyphs dissolving into static. Faulk allowed himself a small, grim smile. He'd done it. The ship's navigation was compromised. But as the voices grew louder, a new thought struck him. This was only the beginning. The faint echoes of Drothak voices grew louder, their sharp clicks and guttural tones reverberating through the metallic halls. James Falk's heart beat in rhythm with the flickering lights of the alien navigation console he had just sabotaged. The glyphs dissolved into erratic patterns, their once pristine structure replaced with chaos. He took a step back, his body tense, his mind racing. "Alex," Faulk whispered, his voice low but urgent, "we need to move." The boy turned from the doorway, his face pale under the green glow of the alien light. "They're coming, aren't they?" Faulk nodded, gripping Alex's shoulder with steady hands. "We've got time, but not much. Stay close and follow my lead." The two slipped back into the shadowy maze of maintenance tunnels, their movements silent and deliberate. The faint hum of the ship pulsed through the cold metal walls, a reminder that they were trespassers in an unforgiving machine. Faulk's senses sharpened, every creak and hiss of the ship amplifying in his mind. The Drothak weren't just searching, they were hunting. The air in the tunnel grew colder as they descended into the lower levels. The smell of ionized metal mingled with the faint, acrid scent of alien lubricants. Faulk's fingers brushed against a wall as they moved, the surface smooth yet faintly warm, as though the ship itself was alive and aware of their intrusion. They stopped at a junction, the tunnel splitting into 3 paths. Faulk crouched, his keen eyes scanning the faint markings along the walls, searching for anything that resembled direction. The Drothak's overconfidence in their own systems worked to his advantage. The markings were functional but not encrypted, and Faulk quickly deciphered the path to engineering. "Left," he muttered. "We'll head toward the power relays." Alex hesitated. "But why not go back to the others? Shouldn't we free them now?" Faulk glanced at the boy, his expression hard but not unkind. "We can't. Not yet. If we release them without crippling this ship, we'll be cornered. We have to strike first, take away their control. Then we'll get everyone out." Alex's small frame seemed to sag, but he nodded, his trust in Faulk unwavering. Together they crept down the left tunnel, the path sloping gently downward. The vibrations beneath their feet intensified, the hum of the ship's power core growing louder with each step. The engineering bay loomed ahead, its entrance framed by sharp, angular supports that pulsed with green light. Faulk stopped just outside, motioning for Alex to stay back. He peered inside, taking in the massive chamber. The room was a sprawling hive of alien machinery. Rows of cylindrical power relays lined the walls, their surfaces crackling faintly with contained energy. Overhead, conduits snaked across the ceiling like veins, feeding the power core that dominated the center of the chamber. The core itself was a monstrous sphere, its surface a swirling maelstrom of light and shadow. The air thrummed with its power, a low, resonating hum that seemed to vibrate in Faulk's bones. Drothak engineers moved with purpose, their insectoid forms darting between consoles and machinery. They communicated in sharp bursts of sound, their focus entirely on maintaining the core's output. Faulk's lips curled into a grim smile. They hadn't even considered the possibility of an intruder in their sacred domain. "Alex," he whispered, pulling the boy close. "See those relays?" He pointed to the cylindrical devices lining the walls. "They're what distribute power to the rest of the ship. If we take them offline, we cripple their systems." Alex nodded, his small hands clenching into fists. "How do we do it?" Faulk reached into his pocket, pulling out the makeshift device he had used earlier. "Same way we sabotage the conduits, but this time we go big. We don't just cause a flicker, we force a cascade failure." Alex's eyes widened. "Won't that blow things up?" Faulk smirked faintly. "That's the idea. Controlled chaos. Enough to disable the ship, but not enough to destroy it. We still need to get the others out." The boy swallowed hard, but nodded. "What do you need me to do?" Faulk crouched, meeting Alex's gaze. "I need you to stay low and attach these to as many relays as you can." He handed the boy 2 smaller devices, each cobbled together from fragments scavenged during their escape. "Place them near the base, where the energy's strongest. Once they're in place, we'll trigger them remotely." "What about you?" Alex asked, his voice trembling. "I'll handle the core," Faulk said. "It's risky, but if I can overload its output for even a few seconds, it'll force a ship-wide reboot. That's our window to act." Alex hesitated, his small face pinched with fear. "What if they catch us?" Faulk placed a hand on the boy's shoulder, his grip firm but reassuring. "They won't, and if they do, I'll deal with it. You just focus on the relays, okay?" The boy nodded, his resolve hardening. "Okay." Faulk waited until Alex slipped into the shadows, then moved toward the core. The heat in the chamber was stifling, the air thick and heavy. Sweat beaded on his brow as he approached the swirling sphere of energy, its surface pulsing like a living heart. He crouched beside one of the central consoles, his hands working quickly to disable the safeguards. The glyphs on the console shifted and writhed, their patterns growing erratic as Faulk's sabotage took hold. The core's hum deepened, its light flickering as though it sensed his intrusion. Faulk gritted his teeth, his fingers flying over the controls. A sudden, sharp hiss cut through the air, and Faulk froze. He turned his head slowly, his heart sinking as he saw a Drothak engineer staring at him, its multifaceted eyes narrowing with realization. The alien let out a sharp burst of sound, its mandibles flaring. Faulk moved instantly, his body a blur, as he launched himself at the engineer. The two collided, the impact sending them both crashing into a nearby console. The alien hissed, its claws raking against Faulk's arm, but he twisted away, driving his elbow into its thorax. The engineer crumpled, its body convulsing faintly before going still. The commotion, however, had drawn the attention of the other engineers. Alarms blared, the shrill sound echoing through the chamber. Faulk's pulse quickened as Drothak guards stormed into the room, their weapons glowing ominously. "Alex!" Faulk bellowed, his voice cutting through the chaos. "Now!" The boy emerged from the shadows, his hands darting over the devices he had placed on the relays. With a flick of his wrist, he triggered them, the relays erupting in sparks and bursts of light. The chamber shook violently, the core's glow intensifying as its systems overloaded. Faulk sprinted toward Alex, grabbing the boy and pulling him behind a console as the guards opened fire. The air was filled with the acrid stench of burning circuits and the deafening roar of the failing core. "We did it!" Alex shouted, his voice barely audible over the noise. "Not yet," Faulk muttered, his eyes scanning the room. The core was teetering on the brink of collapse, but it wasn't enough. They needed to disable it completely. With a deep breath, Faulk pulled out his final device, a crude but powerful EMP grenade. He glanced at Alex, his expression grim. "Stay here, no matter what happens." Before Alex could protest, Faulk darted toward the core, weaving through the chaos. He reached the base of the sphere, his fingers trembling as he armed the grenade. The heat was unbearable now, the core's light blinding. With a final, defiant roar, Faulk hurled the grenade into the heart of the core. The explosion was instantaneous, a blinding flash of light that consumed the chamber. The last thing Faulk saw before the world went dark was Alex's wide, terrified eyes. And then silence. Blinding darkness swallowed everything as the EMP grenade detonated, tearing through the alien engineering bay with an eruption of static energy. The Drothak's pulsating green lights flickered once, twice, then vanished. Silence fell like a heavy shroud, broken only by the faint, echoing creaks of metal straining under the sudden loss of power. James Falk felt the floor drop out beneath him, his world reduced to disorientation and the faint hum of residual energy crackling in the void. He opened his eyes slowly, blinking against the lingering afterimage of the explosion. His body screamed in protest as he pushed himself upright, his hands scraping against the cold, jagged metal of the floor. The acrid stench of burning circuits clawed at his throat, and every breath carried the taste of scorched air. "Alex!" Falk croaked, his voice raw. He forced his legs to move, stumbling toward where the boy had been crouched moments before. His hands found Alex's small frame, still and unnervingly limp in the dim glow of the emergency lights. Panic surged through Falk like a bolt of lightning. "Alex!" he said again, louder this time. He pressed trembling fingers to the boy's neck, relief flooding him as he felt the faint but steady pulse beneath his skin. The boy groaned softly, his eyes fluttering open. "Mr. Falk?" he murmured, his voice groggy. "Yeah, kid, I'm here," Falk said, his voice thick with relief. He helped Alex sit up, one arm steadying him as the boy shook off the daze. "You did good, Alex. Better than good." The boy offered a faint, lopsided grin. "We did it?" "Not yet," Falk said, his eyes scanning the darkened chamber. "This was just the first punch. We've got to keep hitting." The ship was in chaos. The once immaculate hum of its systems was replaced by a cacophony of sputtering conduits and blaring alarms. The Drothak had been caught off guard, their arrogance shattered by a single, calculated strike. Falk knew their disarray was temporary. They'd regroup quickly, and when they did, the humans trapped aboard would have no chance unless he acted decisively. Falk pulled Alex to his feet, his grip firm but gentle. "Stay close. We've got to move." The corridors beyond the engineering bay were a study in alien disarray. Emergency lights bathed the walls in flickering hues of crimson and green. and the rhythmic pounding of boots echoed from somewhere deeper within the ship. Faulk led Alex through the shadows, his senses sharpened to a razor's edge. "We need to reach the central command deck," Faulk said, his voice low. "That's where they'll regroup. If we can disrupt their communications and tactical coordination, we'll buy enough time for Earth's fleet to strike." Alex glanced at him, wide-eyed. "Fleet? You mean they're coming?" "They will be," Faulk replied, "if they're not already on the move. The signal I sent should have reached them by now, but we've got to keep the Drothak too busy to focus on them." As they crept through the ship's twisting corridors, Faulk's mind raced with possibilities. The Drothak were meticulous, but their reliance on centralized systems made them vulnerable. Their communications network was likely housed near the core command hub. If he could infiltrate it, severing their command structure would cripple their ability to respond. They reached a junction, and Faulk crouched low, peering around the corner. Ahead, a squad of Drothak guards swept through the corridor, their weapons glowing faintly in the dim light. Faulk held up a hand to stop Alex, his eyes narrowing as he assessed the situation. "Wait here," Faulk whispered. "I'll clear the way." Before Alex could protest, Faulk moved. He slipped through the shadows with the predatory grace of a seasoned soldier, his movements silent as a whisper. The guards never saw him coming. Faulk struck with precision, his fists and scavenged shard of metal dispatching them in a flurry of sharp, calculated blows. The last guard crumpled to the floor, its weapon clattering uselessly against the metal. Faulk returned to Alex, his breath steady despite the exertion. "Come on," he said, motioning for the boy to follow. The central command deck was a fortress of alien technology, its walls lined with consoles that pulsed faintly with residual energy. The room was eerily quiet, the hum of systems replaced by the occasional crackle of malfunctioning displays. Drothak officers clustered around the main console, their antennae twitching in frustration as they worked to restore order. Faulk studied them from the shadows, his mind calculating angles and variables. The command deck was well guarded, but the chaos he had sown in engineering had thinned their forces. He turned to Alex, his voice low and steady. "Listen carefully," Faulk said. "There's a ventilation shaft just over there." He pointed to a narrow grate on the far wall. "It leads directly to the central node. I need you to get in there and plant this." He handed Alex a small, improvised device, its surface bristling with exposed wires and blinking lights. "Once it's in place, it'll send out an electromagnetic pulse, not as strong as the one in engineering, but enough to fry their communications." Alex's hands trembled as he took the device. "What about you?" "I'll keep them busy," Faulk said, "but you've got to move fast. We only get one shot at this." The boy nodded, his fear tempered by determination. He slipped into the shaft with surprising agility, his small frame disappearing into the shadows. Faulk watched him go, then turned his attention back to the Drothak officers. Time to make some noise. Faulk stepped into the room, his movements deliberate. The Drothak turned as one, their mandibles flaring in surprise. Faulk smiled grimly, raising a weapon he had scavenged from one of the guards. "Looking for me?" he said, his voice laced with defiance. The officers reacted instantly, their weapons snapping up to fire. Faulk moved like a ghost, weaving through the chaos as energy blasts scorched the air around him. He ducked behind a console, returning fire with calculated precision. Sparks flew, the acrid smell of burning metal filling the air. The Drothak's focus was entirely on Faulk, their shouts and weapons directed at the elusive human. They never noticed the faint clinking sounds coming from the ventilation shaft above. Alex reached the central node, his fingers trembling as he placed the device. The air inside the shaft was stifling, the metal walls slick with condensation. He activated the device with a flick of a switch, its lights blinking in rapid succession. The pulse detonated. The command deck erupted in chaos as consoles shorted out and displays flickered wildly. Drothak officers scrambled to contain the damage, their shouts mingling with the hiss of sparking wires. Faulk used the distraction to strike, his movements a blur as he dismantled their defenses. By the time the Drothak regained control, it was too late. Their communications were severed, their command structure in disarray. Faulk helped Alex out of the shaft, his hand steady on the boy's shoulder. "You did it," Faulk said, his voice filled with pride. "We did it!" The ship shuddered violently, the distant rumble of explosions echoing through its halls. Faulk's smile was grim as he glanced at the trembling displays. Earth's fleet had arrived. The Drothak warship shuddered violently, its once unshakable frame groaning under the relentless assault from Earth's fleet. Each impact sent tremors coursing through its halls, sparks raining from exposed conduits as systems failed one by one. James Falk stood in the wreckage of the command deck, his shoulders squared against the chaos around him. He watched the Drothak officers flounder, their once commanding presence reduced to frantic movements and panicked clicks of their mandibles. "They're falling apart," Falk murmured, his voice a quiet rumble that carried more steel than triumph. He turned to Alex, who stood beside him, wide-eyed but resolute. "Stay close, it's not over yet." Outside, through the fractured viewports of the command deck, Earth's fleet loomed like a swarm of vengeful titans. The Vanguard, Earth's flagship, led the charge, its sleek hull bristling with weapons that pulsed with a cold, calculated energy. The Drothak ships tried to maneuver, their formations faltering as Earth's forces exploited every weakness Falk had exposed. A transmission crackled through the remains of the Drothak comm system, its once pristine tones now laced with static. The guttural voice of General Drothak filled the room, his rage palpable even through the distortion. "This is impossible," Drothak snarled. "They were supposed to be primitive, weak. How is this happening?" Falk's lips twisted into a grim smile as he keyed into the comm system. "Funny thing about humans," he said, his voice carrying an edge sharp enough to cut through the static. "We tend to surprise you when it matters most." There was a pause on the other end, the silence heavy with disbelief. Then Drothak's voice returned, quieter now, but no less venomous. "Who are you?" "Just a teacher," Falk replied, "and you made the mistake of taking my kids." Drothak's response was drowned out by another explosion, this one closer, sending the command deck into chaos. Falk pulled Alex behind a fallen console as debris rained down around them. The boy's breathing was shallow, his small hands clutching at Falk's sleeve. "What now?" Alex asked, his voice barely audible. Falk placed a steadying hand on the boy's shoulder. "Now we finish it." The Drothak officers had rallied, their antennae twitching as they regrouped around the main console. Falk's eyes narrowed, his mind racing. The Drothak's desperation was their greatest vulnerability. They would be scrambling to regain control of their fleet, but Falk knew they were out of time. "Alex," he said, his voice low and firm, "I need you to find cover. Stay out of sight until I come back." The boy hesitated, his wide eyes searching Falk's face. "But what if—" "No what-ifs," Falk interrupted. "You've been brave, braver than anyone could have asked. But now, I need you to trust me." Alex nodded reluctantly, slipping into the shadows as Falk rose from his cover. The Drothak officers turned as one, their weapons snapping into place. Falk stepped into the open, his movements deliberate, his eyes fixed on the central console. "Don't move!" one of the officers hissed, its mandibles clicking in warning. Falk raised his hands slowly, the faint smirk never leaving his face. "Move? I'm right where I want to be." Before the Drothak could react, Falk lunged forward, his hands slamming onto the console. His fingers danced across the alien glyphs, his movements precise and unyielding. The officers roared in fury, their weapons discharging blindly, but Falk was already ahead of them. The console erupted in sparks as he overloaded its systems, the resulting shockwave throwing the Drothak back. The lights on the command deck flickered and died, plunging the room into a tense, suffocating silence. For a moment, the only sound was the distant rumble of Earth's fleet tearing through the Drothak's remaining defenses. Then slowly, the emergency lights blinked on, casting the room in a cold, crimson glow. Falk straightened, his breath coming in sharp bursts. He turned to the viewport, his gaze fixed on the Vanguard as it advanced on the Drothak flagship. The humans had won the battle, but Falk knew the war wasn't over. Not yet. The comm system crackled to life once more, this time carrying the voice of General Adrian Kane, Earth's military commander. "Commander Falk." Kane's voice was calm but edged with tension. "We're in position. Do you have control of the ship?" "Negative," Falk replied, his voice steady despite the weight pressing on him. "Their systems are shot, but the core's still active. If they self-destruct, we lose everything." Kane's response was immediate. "Understood. Can you neutralize it?" Falk's jaw tightened. "I can try." He turned, his eyes meeting Alex's as the boy emerged from his hiding spot. "Stay here," Falk said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "If anything happens—" "I'll find a way out," Alex finished, his voice steady, despite the fear in his eyes. "I know." Falk nodded once, then disappeared into the corridor leading to the core. The heat intensified with every step, the air growing heavier as he approached the heart of the ship. The core chamber was a cauldron of energy, its swirling light casting jagged shadows across the walls. The Drothak had already begun their final gambit. The core pulsed violently, its energy spikes erratic and unstable. Falk moved quickly, his hands working to disable the fail-safes that would trigger the detonation. Sweat dripped down his face, his breath ragged as he fought against the ticking clock. The Drothak officers burst into the chamber, their weapons raised. Falk didn't flinch. He turned to face them, his voice a sharp bark that cut through the chaos. "Stand down," he shouted. "You've lost. Don't make this worse." One of the officers hesitated, its mandibles clicking uncertainly. Another stepped forward, its voice a low growl. "We will not yield to primitives." Falk's eyes narrowed. "Primitives?" He gestured to the raging core, its energy threatening to consume them all. "You think this is strength? Look around. Your arrogance has blinded you. You underestimated us, and now you're paying the price." The core emitted a sharp, keening wail, its light intensifying. Falk turned back to the console, his fingers moving faster than thought. The Drothak officers shouted, their voices laced with panic, but Falk ignored them. He focused on the task at hand, his mind a blur of strategy and instinct. Finally, with a shuddering gasp, the core stabilized. The light dimmed, its chaotic pulses replaced with a steady hum. Falk stepped back, his shoulders slumping as the tension drained from his body. "It's over," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. The Drothak officers stared at him, their defeat etched into every line of their alien forms. Falk turned, walking past them without a second glance. He had no time for gloating, no need for vengeance. His focus was on the children waiting to be saved. As he reached the command deck, Alex ran to meet him, his small face alight with relief. "You did it!" the boy exclaimed. Falk placed a hand on Alex's shoulder, his expression softening. "We did it." Outside, the Vanguard unleashed its final salvo, the Drothak fleet scattering in defeat. Humanity's strength, its ingenuity and resilience, had turned the tide. Falk stood at the viewport, his eyes on the horizon, as Earth's fleet gathered in triumph. "We're not just survivors," Falk murmured. "We're the reckoning." The Drothak had learned their lesson the hard way. Humanity was not to be underestimated.